Debunking evolution using evolution. If we if we ask an evolutionist, where does mankind come from? They'll usually start start a rant about how mankind evolved from certain other species on the planet. And if you keep pressing them, they'll eventually come up with this theory that that's irrational. And the reason is because usually they'll end up with, well, in the beginning, there was all the setting was just right for life to be made. So, this implies magic, like something magical happened where life just popped up on Earth. And they'll usually start with something small, like the first life on Earth was a cell, like a protozoa cell, and so so is this irrational? Well, not necessarily. I mean, you have to have you have to have the basic cell in order to form more complex structures that would eventually become monkeys and fish and birds and plant life and mankind. But the premise is off. And the reason for the creator would be consciousness itself. So let me explain. So when talking to an evolutionist, all the conditions on Earth were right for life. And the first life forms were these single-celled organisms. Well, at that point, you got to keep pressing or just keep asking yourself, well, what made those cells want to form in the first place? And how were those cells formed? And the evolutionist believes in magic, that they just magically, that atoms just magically got together to form molecules, and molecules just magically got together to form parts, and then those parts just magically got together to form the cell. And of course, magic has nothing to do with life. you know um, and this theory of evolution, it goes on to produce these mindsets of materialism, where we're just a bunch of atoms put together. So how do you get where does consciousness come in? Oh, it's just a product of these molecules. Well, that's bullshit. You can't just have, you can't build a house without a plan, without a blueprint, without some sort of assembly instructions. So let's go back to the cell. The cell has many parts. It has flagellum, which is those hair-like structures. It has a cell wall. It has cytoplasm. It has a nucleus. So, and that's just a few of the parts. And then you have parts inside the nucleus and the cytoplasm and the flagellum. So anyways, one has to ask some basic questions. And the basic question is out of all the elements, we have over 100 that we found. Maybe we only have 100 and the rest are created in a lab. But we have approximately 100 elements. And somehow the cell knows which elements to use. And somehow the cell knows, before it's even a cell, It has to know what elements to use, what quantity to use them in, how to group them together, in such a way to form the parts, and then how to group the parts together to form the whole. Well, in reality, not talking about Keebler cookie elves. A lot of people think Keebler cookie elves and leprechauns built mankind or built the first cell, and this is irrational. But how does the cell know? And how does the cell know before it's even a cell? How to form those parts? Where does it get the know? Where does it get the consciousness from to even form the first molecule? How does it even know? How does it know it needs a wall? How does it know it needs cytoplasm? How does it know it needs a nucleus? How does it know how to form the molecules? How does it know what elements to use, the quantity of elements to use, how to put those elements together to create molecules, how to put those molecules together to create a part, and then how to put those parts together to create the whole cell? Well, obviously, you can't build something unless you know how to build it. You can try to figure it out, but the main premise here is what does this know? Where does this knowledge come from? Where does this knowledge come from in the first place? Where, in order to know, there has to be consciousness. We generally don't look at a rock and go, oh, it's conscious and it has feelings, and maybe we shouldn't touch that rock or throw it or use it to dam a river. We don't look at inanimate objects as life or as having consciousness, and yet the same elements that make up a rock are also found within ourselves. We have iron, we have magnesium, we have some silica. We have salt. We have minerals. Rocks are made out of minerals, and we need minerals to survive. We need minerals to carry on the life cycles and products of our own cells, our own bodies, our own health. But nobody looks at salt and says, oh, that's life and that's consciousness, even though we have 9 grams of salt per liter of blood. How come you're saying that the salt has consciousness all of a sudden? All of a sudden, all these atoms and molecules come together to create the brain, and all of a sudden we have consciousness. Even though if you take all those things apart, they don't have consciousness. So, where does the consciousness come from? Well, you can't have something from nothing, especially in the physical world. You can't get something from nothing. So where does this know come from? Where does the knowledge come from that allows elements to form into molecules, which allows molecules to form into parts, which allows parts to form into the cell in the first place? Well, that knowledge is consciousness, and the only rationality is it comes from another consciousness. You and I have consciousness, which allows us to make decisions, allows us to build, allows us to assemble, allows us to put carrots and potatoes and onions together with a slab of beef to make a pot roast. We have that. We had to get that knowledge in order to make pot roast, in order to make a bench, in order to make, whatever it is we're making, a refrigerator at a factory. So then you have to ask other questions like, why does the cell divide? Why does the cell want to survive? Why does the cell want to evolve? Why does the cell have instincts? Instincts are a part of consciousness. Why do you and I want to survive? Why do we have survival instincts? Why does a rabbit have survival instincts? A fox, a wolf, a dog? Why do we have survival instincts? Well, that's because instincts come from consciousness. So if you're talking to an evolutionist, you're talking to someone that hasn't really thought it through, because they're being irrational. You have to have knowledge. You have to have consciousness to even want to survive. So once again, the evolutionists will say, well, let's go all the way back to the beginning. And I'll say, okay, let's go. You and I weren't there, but go ahead, run your mouth. Well, all the conditions on Earth were just right for life. Okay, that makes sense. And the first life was the cell. Okay, so how did the cell know how to make itself? Well, it just did. Well, no, it didn't just make itself. You have to have blueprints. You don't, nobody builds a house without blueprints, without an architect. What's the architect? Who is the architect? Well, that would be the great consciousness. That word God is what most people will use to describe that great consciousness, that great spirit, that universal mind that created life in the first place. How do we know that? Well, I just described why that has to be. That has to be because the cell had knowledge. In order to know, what's a rock know? Nothing. Does it even know it's a rock? No. In order to have life, you have to have consciousness. In order to build life, there has to be a consciousness behind that life. Otherwise, you can't build nothing. Minerals and elements don't just magically create stuff on their own. There's no Keebler cookie elves in the universe, putting together your cookies. That's irrational, and quite frankly, that's stupid. Quite frankly, it's retarded. It's retarded to even think that things just magically happen. And then you have to explain, an evolutionist has to explain, why would you evolve into something else that just eats the thing that it evolved from? Like, what was the purpose of evolving? Was there a reason why a fish evolved into a shark that just ends up eating the fish? Is there a reason why evolution creates a seal and a shark, and then the shark just eats the seal? Like, how do you come up with all that crap? What's how do you explain how the entire system of the body evolves piece by piece. You can't. The entire system of the body has to be in place before the system can even operate in the first place. You can't. What's the purpose of a stomach if you don't have a mouth? What's the purpose of the bacteria in the intestines if you don't have the mouth, the stomach? You know, what's the purpose of having food if you can't see it, catch it, hunt it, grow it? The entire system has to be in place before the system can even work. Don't believe me? Look at a car. Yeah, if all 2,000 of those parts aren't together working all in unison, if the engine isn't working with the tranny, isn't working with the drivetrain, isn't working with the fuel injection, isn't working with the fuel tank, I mean, does your car even operate? Does it even move? Well, the answer is no. You can't just put an engine on the ground and say you have a car. What was the purpose of the engine? In other words, in order for mankind to even be mankind, the entire system of mankind had to be in place. The entire system of nature has to be in place. All the parts of our bodies has to be in place all at once in order for the body to even work in the first place. You see, evolution, it presumes magic. Well, that's not reality. Reality is, in order to have consciousness, you have to have a consciousness behind the consciousness. You and I are conscious. And where does that consciousness come from? Well, it can't possibly come from evolution, because the knowledge has to come first. The knowledge of who we are and what we are to become has to come first. And that's where the universal mind comes in. That's where the creator comes in. That's where the great spirit comes in. The great consciousness. God. Jehovah. Reality itself. Existence itself. Nature itself. Has to be in place. That consciousness has to be in place. It is non-physical. It is the non-physical consciousness which creates the physical. And we exist in two worlds at once, two realms at once. We exist in the physical and a non-physical realm at the same time. We have physical and we have the non-physical. The non-physical is consciousness. And that would include instincts, emotions, memories, knowledge of the past, knowledge that we will have a future, creativity, imagination. All that stuff is non-physical, and all that stuff belongs to consciousness. You can't put something together like a brain, like a mind, and then say, oh, it all of a sudden gets consciousness. No, because you have to have consciousness before in order to direct the elements to form the brain in the first place. There has to be an architect. There has to be assembly instructions to form the brain in the first place. And scientists have already proven, even though most of them are evolutionists, that they've already proven that consciousness doesn't just reside in the brain. Consciousness is throughout the entire body. That's why you hear all these stories of organ transplants. You know, people that never smoked, never drank, all of a sudden get a kidney transplant, a heart transplant, a liver transplant, and the consciousness of the individual that they receive those organs from starts interacting with their own consciousness, and they might start getting a craving for chocolate. which they never had before. They might start smoking cigarettes, which they never did before. They all of a sudden just want to do these things because consciousness exists. It exists in every organ, and therefore it must exist in every molecule, and therefore it must exist in every single cell. Anyways, that's how you prove to an evolutionist that evolution is irrational and nonsensical. Thank you for listening.